Welcome to The Next Stage, the podcast where we turn up the house lights on the future of venue management. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just getting started, this is your go-to source for the latest trends, innovations, and best practices in the venue and event management industry.
The amount of information and the amount of change and the amount of opportunity has never been greater.
We've literally broken down walls and we're looking at how can we create a more seamless experience.
There's customer demand for sustainability now.
On the forefront when it comes to venues that might not look like what you think of as a venue today.
Welcome back to The Next Stage. I'm your host, VMA CEO Joel Edmondson, and with me today is Craig McMaster, Director of Riverside Theatre. Welcome.
G'day, how are you?
Good to see you.
Good to be here. Good to be here.
Craig, we're here today to have a broader chat about the role of community engagement in venue development. But the big and exciting news of your life in the present moment is the development of the Riverside Theatre in Parramatta. For those of us who aren't familiar with it, can you tell us about the theatre and the journey you've been on with it?
Yeah, great. So Riverside, Joel's been around. We're heading up for our 38th year this year, 38 years of operation. The venue is currently a 760-seat proscenium house theatre with two other smaller theatres, and it's got a really storied history of being part of Western Sydney and of being sort of the key cultural facility in Western Sydney. The building's end of life, so I was tasked a few years ago when I took on the role of director to lead the project to redevelop it, and I'm thrilled to confirm that we've now got confirmed funding of $276 million for the redevelopment that's going to see us treble it in size. We're going to repurpose our existing Riverside Theatre into a new 700-seat playhouse theatre, and then everything else on the site will be completely demolished and redeveloped. And probably the big news is that we're adding a 1,512-seat full-scale Broadway theatre, West End style theatre, and then two other additional spaces, a 324-seat black box theatre for drama and dance and performing arts, and then a 120-seat digital studio and cinema that also can fully retract and become a rehearsal space. So it's going to be a pretty amazing facility. And so, yeah, it's not a bad gig to get to lead a project like that.
And $276 million, that is extremely significant in terms of the Australian context.
Absolutely.
How does that compare to other investments that are being made in the country at the moment?
It's right up there. I mean, I think the new theatre in Queensland is about that same sort of budget. It sort of started around in the 200s, I think, and it's probably going to land a little bit higher than that. I think, that sort of 250 to 300 million is what you are seeing spent on a major theatre development, particularly when it involves a big commercial house like a big 1,500 to 2,000 seater. And I think what's really exciting is that we've seen over the last couple of years, we saw Her Majesty's redeveloped in Adelaide. We've seen the Coliseum, which I led that project, developed in Western Sydney as well. And then we've now got the new theatre being developed in Queensland, Canberra Theatre being redeveloped over the next 5 years, which will be a 2,000-seater, and of course Riverside will be a 1,500-seat. So we're seeing this sort of second cities network now starting to develop of major theatres that are perhaps a little bit out of the normal CBD context, or are in secondary sort of scale capital cities. So I think it's going to be very exciting to see what that's going to do to change the touring theatre landscape and effectively create a new circuit that people can tour and outside of the capital cities.
And what you just talked then about the significance of this development to, the country as a whole, but for Sydney as a place and particularly Western Sydney, what does it mean to have this development going on?
I think what we've seen in Parramatta over the last decade is a massive amount of investment in the city overall. The development of Parramatta Square, Parramatta Council's investments in their $130 million Civic Centre, the new pool that's been developed, which was a nearly $100 million project. And now we're seeing the powerhouse Parramatta and a development will open late next year. if you add all of those components together to the major transport infrastructure that's going into Parramatta, Riverside becomes kind of a little bit of the jewel in the crown, sort of that brings together the arts and culture, a component of that entire sort of city rebirthing. So I think what we're going to see is a whole new cultural precinct developing in Parramatta, and that's certainly the intent of the council and of the New South Wales State Government, is to establish Parramatta as a key centre of culture in Western Sydney. They're still working with all of broader Western Sydney and obviously really creating a kind of a centrepiece cultural space that is linked to all of the fantastic transport infrastructure and the new airport and all the things that are happening in Western Sydney. So I think we're going to see a really big change that's going to come from that over the next decade.
And you were talking the other day when we were briefing on this about the development of Sydney as a global city and the role of, satellite parts of the city and not, these cities that have like just one cultural precinct. The cities that are truly globally relevant culturally have multiple kind of centres of culture. What other cities do you think Sydney is aspiring to be like in having this many kind of cultural centres?
I think there's a lot of comparison to what you've seen happen in the UK and the US over the years, but also in Europe. I've just recently come back from London and I was stunned by when I went out to Stratford in East London and saw the redevelopment of the Olympic precinct out there, which has now got a major cultural, arts, retail precinct that's developing on top of the Olympic precinct. And what that's doing with the stimulation of housing and the regeneration and gentrification of what was a somewhat dilapidated area is quite extraordinary. And I couldn't help but feel like I was in Parramatta, to be honest. It had the same vibe to it. It had the same depth of multiculturalism, people from all different colours and races and background all coming together, and really great family vibe, which is what we see in Parramatta as well. Families, a lot of the cultures in places like Parramatta and Stratford have families that are very close, and I was there in Stratford on a Sunday afternoon. I couldn't believe the number of families that were out. So I think what we're going to see is Parramatta develop along that sort of cultural, intent. I've drawn analogies also to what the relationship between Brooklyn and Manhattan, for example, and seeing how Brooklyn has now established itself as with culture as a really significant part of its centre. And New Yorkers are quite comfortable going between those two spaces because they've got good transport. I think the same thing's going to happen in Parramatta. The reality is what used to be when I was first working in Parramatta back in the late 80s and early 90s was an hour and a bit journey from the CBD is now a 22-minute drive, and in a few years is going to be an 18 to 20 minute metro ride. That's going to change the city, and I think people are going to get used to turning right as well as left.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Yeah.
So we are going to get on to talking about the venue development itself a bit at the moment, but you just triggered some thinking for me about Brooklyn and London. Like New York and London are two places with a very, very clear cultural identity globally. Like those places mean something culturally in a quite specific way. Is there any thinking going on at the moment about how the theatre can be a home for new work that tells the story of Parramatta?
Yeah, I mean, we've always had that as a part of our DNA at Riverside. We operate our own production and performing arts company, the National Theatre of Parramatta, and we create work through that entity that essentially originates from Western Sydney or from local artists as much as possible. And we'll be kind of doubling down on that with investment moving forward. But we don't only want to do it through that. We want to do it through partner arts companies as potentially as resident companies in the venue. We've got long relationships with Form Dance and other companies in Parramatta and in Western Sydney that we're in discussions with at the moment. So I think that we'll see more of that work created. I think we're doing some really interesting discussions around culturally specific works with the South Asian community, with the Chinese community. So I think, developing works that are representative of newer Australian stories that aren't necessarily the traditional colonial stories are going to be a key part of the future, so that we've got representation of modern Australian culture rather than sort of a historical view of the world, which I think we've tended to do a little bit in the theatre space. So I think that's really exciting and something that we'll certainly be investing in the future.
And then to add to that, there's the story of the first peoples of the place.
Yep.
And having seen the pictures of the venue, you can see that the venue itself is telling a kind of symbolic story about that place in the way that it has been designed. So I want to talk about that quite a bit, but perhaps beginning with the role of the architects in that kind of ideation process, because obviously there's a lot of stakeholders involved, but they're the kind of creative facilitator of that process. How have the architects engaged in the process of a conversation with community about the building?
That's a really good question. I think a couple of things. One of the things I think that we did very early on in the piece was we as the client, for want of a better word, spoke to our First Nations representatives and partners and said, what is it that you want to see? And we did so on the basis of the working relationship that we have with them now, that acknowledges that we have the privilege of Riverside sitting on a very important place in local Aboriginal Darug culture. It's a place of stories. It's the place, they call it the place where eels lie down, which is where salt water met the fresh water, and it's where the different clans from all across Eora used to come together at various times and meet and share food and stories and so it was always considered a place of peace. Obviously, colonial times changed that when there was a lot of displacement and there was a lot of disharmony that happened through that time. So what we've tried to do always in our relationship with the Darug people is to make it a harmonising relationship. So we started with them, I guess, rather than one of the criticisms that I had from one of our Darug elders when the very first conversations was we're always the last people to be spoken to. And often Aboriginal culture is represented as an afterthought or as something that's stuck on the wall at the end of a fancy design. What we tried to do was turn that on its head and ask them from the get-go what they wanted. I think one of the clever things we did was right at the beginning we invited the 5 teams that were competing in the design competition to a yarning circle with the local Aboriginal elders and representatives, and we just sat in our courtyard and walked around the space and talked about what it meant to be a Darug person growing up in the area, what it meant to consider the history of the space. And I think that really influenced the architect's designs because all of the competition entries came through with very strong representation of the Darug culture and Darug look. I think the Cox design that we've gone with, that was the jury selection, writ that large, really interpreted it in a beautiful way that even considered the space itself, which was considered women's country through the Aboriginal people, the side of the river that we sit on. So even the femininity of the building and its shape was respectful of that. And that's been called out again by some of the local Darug elders.
There's obviously a range of other stakeholders that come into this conversation. There's, council itself, the other community members who might have a view on the space. How do you balance a multiplicity of voices in this process, and are some agendas more important than others to pay attention to?
I think the answer to how do you balance it is very bloody carefully.
Yeah.
Look, I think, ultimately it's about giving every voice some air and making sure you ask the questions and get a sense of what people are looking for. And then our job as leaders of these projects or of these cultural facilities is to try and, as best we can, interpret all of those voices into something that is going to hopefully satisfy as many people as possible. You don't get it right every time. It's never going to be perfect. But I think if you can spend as much time listening to people and asking questions as you do telling people what you're going to do, I think it's a good way to start. And I think that's what we tried to do at the beginning, was just to talk to people and to really understand. We spent a lot of time listening to producers about the scale of the venues that they wanted. We went out and spoke to local theatre companies and said, what sizes of spaces do you need? What are the things that are barriers to you in your day-to-day development of work? And so we've tried as much as possible within the constraint of the budget limitations that you have to come up with something that satisfies as many of those people. And the feedback we've had to date is that we've done that fairly successfully, which is pretty cool. And
obviously this isn't your first rodeo, so you've been involved in developing other venues and, without naming, any specific sort of warts in those processes previously and aligning them to the name of particular venues, what are the things that you have learnt and carried forward from your previous experiences into this particular process?
I think, every project that you work on or every major event that you work on, there's things that you learn that you take in moving forward, both positively and negatively. I think this time one of the things that I've tried to do is really go into it with a much more listening, double the listening sort of approach, to really try and understand what it is that people are looking for. I mean, each of the projects that I've worked on over the last sort of 5 to 7 years have been quite different in their context. So it's probably be inappropriate to say that anyone had any particular warts. I think, what I've tried to do with this one is I guess take the best learnings from all of those projects and go, what were the things that I really loved about that project? And if there were some things that I wasn't able to do last time because of a particular restraint or a budget requirement or whatever, are there clever ways that we can get around that and make this one a kind of a more fully formed facility? And time will tell whether we've got it right or not, but we feel like we're in a pretty good direction so far.
So what are some of those things that you really loved about previous projects?
I think the use of technology, really important. Really understand what your clients are looking for with technology and make sure you've got appropriate, fit-for-purpose, long-term sustainable technology. The importance of environment, making sure that you're environmentally, that the building that you're designing is a building for the future environmentally and that it's going to be sustainable. One of the learnings I learnt last time was, or not last time, but on a previous project was not having kind of really embraced that environmental aspect probably as well as I think we have this time. And really, so looking at things like recycling of current facility, what can we repurpose, so to prevent waste. And probably the big learning is really the talk to the community, and that really came from another project that I worked on where I thought that was done really well. And what I've tried to do is build on that, is to really, take away the thoughts that came out of that, and which was a great outcome in Western Australia, and look at how we can bring that into this project for Western Sydney. Yeah,
fantastic. And you spoke just a little bit before that bit about bringing double listening to the process of consulting and designing this venue. And I think a lot about the challenge of harmonising the thought and intent that went into building and designing the venue and then how it's led when it is built. And I wonder whether there's a translation of that double listening that then comes into the way you'll lead the venue when it's built? Like, tell us about your leadership philosophy in terms of your team and how you envisage that space being activated with a community of people running it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The double listening thing is interesting. My dad's voice echoes in my ears whenever I talk about that, because he always talked about the fact that you've got two ears and one mouth and you should use them in that order and that ratio. I think that idea of curiosity, which is the essence of double listening, it's, be curious. Don't go into a conversation or into a project or to a strategy or anything with anything fixed in your mind. Go into it with curiosity and with a thirst to hear the voices in the room, because maybe you're not the smartest person in the room. Maybe the smartest person in the room is the person that's been standing behind a counter in a box office for 10 years, on this particular occasion. So how you can canvass those opinions and how you can, a small example, we've got people working in our team, some of whom have worked at Riverside for 30 years in technical areas and things like that. These are incredibly talented and knowledgeable people. So, we've engaged them directly with our designers and architects to say, you tell them what you want back of house. You tell them how you want signage done or how you want particular flows to work, rather than us sort of believing that we're the smartest people in the room and know better, which I think sometimes happens. Sometimes leadership steps in and thinks that they know more than the people that are actually doing the do every day. It's a small example, but we've tried to do that at every step through the process, whether it's with our front of house people or whether our back of house people or our producing teams, as far as the design of rehearsal spaces and things like that.
I'm a real believer that architecture can subtly influence the way people behave, and that's what the design of space is all about. And it just feels like a building like this one could encourage like a more intuitive approach to venue management, more connected to sort of principles of nature and regeneration, and, like a structure that's sort of, 4 square walls, and very much about a sort of factory process of moving people through. And, I just think that there's an intangible value in good architectural design for venues that can have unexpected benefits down the track for how it will be run.
Yeah, I think the most important thing to remember about venue design is that we are actually creative spaces, and we're places where people should be invited and welcome to come together and create, not places that are, closed door, locked out, kind of, we know better kind of spaces. And so that was one of the things we actually briefed into the design, right? From we wrote a very significant, I guess, aspirational statement that was about, this is who we see ourselves being in the future. This is what we want to be to the community. This is what we want the space to be. And I think the design actually talks to that. The design is very transparent. It's very open. It has these kind of big portal entries that are really welcoming with the main points of traffic flow, which is the complete opposite of what we are now. We have a sort of side door almost at the moment. The building sort of faces in on itself because it was built at a time when the river wasn't clean and wasn't embraced. And so it was built to face the park, not the river. We've kind of turned that upside down, and we're really wanting to embrace the river and embrace everything that it now means for both the city and for particularly local Aboriginal people.
Are there any other success measures that we haven't talked about yet that, you get to the end of this project and the place is up and running and you'd be able to put your hand on your heart and say we achieved what we set out to do?
Oh, look, I think the big one is going to be the traction that we get with the producer promoter community. ultimately. You know, that's the big test. Because at the end of the day, we're in the bums on seats business, right? And you can have all these great aspirations and all of the fantastic design intent and creative intent, but if nobody comes and sees your shows, well, you're just a big house with empty seats. So, you know, our key measure is going to be we want to see world-class shows coming to Parramatta. We want to see, you know, major performing artists, you know, premiering shows with us. And we're going to invest to help encourage that. We're developing some interesting new models around commercialisation with people that I think are going to encourage people as well. But so far, there's really good engagement from the producer community. So we're excited to see where that's going to take us. And, you know, ask me in 2030.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's a
that's
journey.
when you'll know.
Yeah, and audience development is probably like the fuzziest space in the performing arts in terms of really the industry broadly having methodologies that we know will work, particularly in communities that haven't had a facility like this where, you know, if you're not bringing in a Broadway type show into a 1,500 seat theatre and you're doing things more challenging and that hasn't been there before, you know, how do you take that risk as a centre? Is that something that you're thinking about much at the moment?
Yeah, it is. But I think the other thing that's really interesting is the power that you can create from embracing new cultural dynamics as well. You know, Parramatta is the South Asian centre of Sydney. It is got the fastest growing and most significant Indian and South Asian community in Australia. We've already had enormous success at Riverside with doing works with South Asian cultural heritage, both community works like things like Aaron Gettrams and which are community sort of celebrations, and also commercial works. And some of those commercial, we did some comedians, you know, Hindu comedians last year, where the whole thing was done in Hindi and sold out multiple shows, you know, and those things are, you know, a bit like what we're seeing in the touring arena market with K-pop, for example. We've just done a big K-pop festival last weekend with full houses last weekend. So there's, you know, I think, you know, there is so much cultural depth in Western. There's so much raw material to play with. It's not just about bringing in commercial Western artists to drive your success. Obviously, that's going to be part of our formula. We want to do that, and that's, you know, there's good money in that. But there's gold in them the hills out there with the cultural depth that we've got to play with. So we can't wait to sort of dive into that and work with the community to bring those works.
On the K-pop example, so my background prior to this job has been in the sort of music industry development space, and for over a decade watching the music industry really asleep to this opportunity. And a close friend of mine's, you know, one of the early indie music festival promoters in Shanghai. And, you know, his story to me is that he's spent years and years and years knocking on the doors of the bigger promoters in Australia saying, look at the Australian population, the opportunity that's here to engage. And it just hasn't been on people's radar. But, I mean, commercially, it's the most common sense thing you could possibly do in Western Sydney. And I think that it's a bit of a watershed moment in truly becoming a multicultural country when the culture of the place itself and the commerciality of the cultural industries begins to reflect who the market really is. That's a sign that we have really evolved into a much more genuinely multicultural nation.
I agree with you. And I think you know, going back to your earlier question about the things that are analogous to great cultural cities, that's what Brooklyn does. It's what, you know, it's what you see in Europe, all across Europe, where there are specific culturally focused works that are presented on a regular basis, along with Western work, you know, traditional Western work. So I think getting that blend right in the future is going to be an important success factor for us. do we still want to do, a Lion King or something like that? You bet, obviously, because those things also appeal to all of those cultures. But we're interested in investing in and sort of, pushing the boundaries a little bit on some of the new works in other spaces as well.
So beyond being engaged in the kind of practice that you are and doing the work that you are there other resources that you and others can turn to become better informed around this kind of community engagement part of venue development and operations? Or is this really a discovery process that you've got to be part of?
It's pretty discovery.
Yeah.
And again, I'll go back to my comments earlier about curiosity. I think it all comes from a place of curiosity and, also kind of reading the data and reading the tea leaves. If you don't have to be a genius to work out if you're the centre of South Asian culture in Western Sydney, you want to develop relationships culturally and that are real relationships with the Indian community. And you want to provide work and services that look after and cater to that community. Same with the Darug culture. There is a significant growing Darug culture in Western Sydney that is embracing its history.
Mm.
You'd be crazy not to be a part of that story and to be a part of supporting them through their growth journey and understanding what that journey is and understanding where they're heading is going to be really important to informing what decisions you make about what you want to culturally develop or present.
And, that's a very wise approach to doing this kind of work. Are there any other wisdoms you'd like to share in closing today from your career? What are the things that when you get up every day, you go to work are kind of fundamental to the way you approach working with other people to do what we do?
Look, I steer away from using the word wisdom. I don't like to think of myself as wise at all. It sounds like I'm about 400 years old too. But I think just what we try to do culturally with our team at Riverside is we talk a lot about kindness and tolerance and looking out for each other. And I think if that fundamentally informs your centre, it changes your leadership style. And I'm one of the things I'm really proud of working for the City of Parramatta is the City of Parramatta culturally is also like that as an organisation. It is an organisation that is based on, which has the care of its people as a very important part. And so I think when you approach your leadership style with the belief that everybody's doing the best they can and everybody wants to do a good job and everybody's fair income about your mission, you approach it it enables you to approach it with that curiosity because you don't have the cynicism in the room. It's a much more open, gentle, I guess, kind of approach. And it doesn't mean it's not commercially tough or that it's not rigorous in its approach. It just means that it's, to be blunt, don't be a dick.
Mm.
Just it's a be nice, trust people, believe that their intent is good, and then support them to deliver that good intent as best as you can. That's our job. Our job as leaders is to, support the success of the people that we have the privilege of working with, not to focus on criticising where they make the occasional mistake.
And that inevitably translates into the guest experience, right? And then the value the community gets out of it.
Yeah,
I don't think you can run a venue in a way that's contradictory to the culture that you're trying to express externally.
Absolutely not. And I mean, our approach to customer service is always about the word yes, even if it's occasionally a conditional yes. Yes, we can help you, but occasionally
this is
necessary. This is how.
Yeah.
It may not be perfect, but we can help you. And so that sort of yes-based approach, which is I think something that we spent a lot of time on in the first year that I was at Riverside of really, inculcating that into our people of just saying, look, everything you might have believed, previously, or things you might have thought before that weren't possible, they're all possible. We might just need to do it a different way. And what we've seen is some really great young leadership stories emerge as a result of that. Once you take the handcuffs off people and let them fly a little bit, you start to realise where your depth of talent is, which kind of comes back to what I was talking about earlier, which is then harnessing that IP that's just resident in your business and is lurking in the shadows of the back of house, just by, creating an environment where people feel like it's safe and free to be okay to contribute.
And can that extend then, in closing, I think this is a good way of wrapping it up, can that extend then into the permission people in the community feel about the way they engage with the venue as well?
Very much so.
Which is its key purpose.
That's what we're there to do. We're there to be. We talk all the time that, and again, these words came from one of our Durrogue elders, that this is a place of stories. So we talk that Riverside is a place where people come together and share stories, whether it's presenting stories, whether it's talking to one another, whether it's our staff sharing their stories. So that idea, the important part of storytelling is also being prepared to be a listener. And so that idea that we continue to go out and say, we want to hear your stories, we want you to come and share your stories with us, I think encourages people to approach us and say, hey, I've got this work that I'm looking at doing or develop. We invest in developing new artists that will probably never present on our stages at times, but they might be in our rehearsal room, for a couple of months and then go on to do something else elsewhere. We've got artists that we've invested in the last couple of years that have gone on to great success nationally. And so you can't look at this you can't look at our industry, in my opinion, as something that's got to be always in the immediate return game. You've got to play the long game and be prepared to invest in the people that are of your community to enable them to have success either with you or elsewhere.
Thank you for investing your time today and coming on the podcast, and for being so generous yourself. That obviously reflects the culture that you're building within the venue.
Thanks.
I really encourage everyone to get on the website and check out the design of the building. I think it's an incredible statement about Western Sydney and incredibly exciting for Australia. So, we all wish you all the best, and perhaps in, 2 years' time you can come back on the podcast and we can talk about all the progress that's been made.
Love to. It's been great chatting with you. Thanks, mate.
Great. Thanks, Craig. And we'll see you next time on the next stage. Bye for now.